You're listening to the Valley Labor Report with David Story and Jacob Morrison.
The time has come for America to hear the truth.
We are going to stand with them, and not only are we going to fight for their rights, but we're going to stand up for our rights here in our state, in our homes, and in our community.
One day longer, one day stronger. One day longer, one day stronger.
Because the future of labor's rights in the United States of America is not going to be decided in the courts. It's not going to be decided in Congress. It's not going to be decided on talk radio, and it sure is not going to be decided on Fox News.
Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. Solidarity forever. For the union makes us strong.
Good morning, Tennessee Valley. This is the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host and fellow agitator, David Story. It is Saturday, December 5th, 2020, and we are broadcasting live to tape, online and on the radio on WVNN in the Huntsville, Decatur, Athens listening area from Athens, Alabama. The recording of this program will play tomorrow, Sunday, December 6th, 2020, on the great WGOL in Russellville, Alabama. Today, we have a very special show for you about the situation as it stands in Bolivia. I'll explain further in a short while. Here at the top, though, I'll apologize for my voice. I've caught cold, and unfortunately, I couldn't put off recording this intro any longer. I did get tested, and thankfully it was not COVID, but I've still got a bit of a sick voice. So anyway, thanks for tuning in, folks. We appreciate your time. If you want to see what we're up to throughout the week, get our snide quips about the news of the day, then you should follow us on social media. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Valley Labor Report. We're on Twitter at Labor Reporters. I'm on Twitter at JacobM_AL. David is on Twitter at Radical Unionist. That's spelled RADICL Unionist. And if you missed part of the show and you want to go back and watch it later, search YouTube for The Valley Labor Report and subscribe to our channel. You can go back and watch the full show there, and we also clip segments and release them throughout the week. We also upload the program on more than 11 different podcasting apps. So, to see if we are on your listening platform of choice, go to thevalleylabor.transistor.fm/subscribe. We do now have a website where you can find all of the previously mentioned stuff, thevalleylabor.org. And finally, if you appreciate our work and want to help us stay on the air, consider throwing us a couple dollars a month on patreon.com/thevalleylabor-report. So, about that special episode. There's been a lot happening in Bolivia over the past year or so. There was an election last year, and the clear Democratic winner was forced out by the military, leading to an unpopular, fascistic minor member of parliament being chosen by other international forces to ascend to the presidency. This was a coup. Under the coup government, there were a myriad of human rights abuses, massacres, persecution of political opponents, and more. Fortunately for the people of Bolivia, there were brave women and men on the ground in social movements and the labor movement who were still willing to stand up to this repressive regime and were able to force elections and vote out the coup government overwhelmingly by about 20 points. The story of Bolivia is a story of the power of ordinary working people, and that's why we felt it so important to tell. It's important to connect the struggles of working people across borders because we have fundamentally far more in common with the working Bolivian, Guatemalan, Nigerian, Chinese, you name it, than we will ever have with the oligarchs in our own country. And we can learn from the working people. We can learn from the struggles of working people across borders. We can learn from their wins and we can learn from their losses. The story of Bolivia, hell, this current chapter isn't finished yet. Of course, the story of a people never is, but it looks hopeful for the first time in more than a year. To help tell this story, we found and interviewed 6 people, 6 experts on Bolivia. The rest of the show will be our conversations with those folks. Each conversation was approximately an hour long, and we had to cut each conversation down to less than 10 minutes. As you can imagine, a lot was left out. Each conversation will be made available online, however, and our patrons will get access to the interviews 2 to 3 weeks earlier than everyone else. So what we're going to do is a new conversation will be made available to patrons each day next week, beginning on Sunday, with our conversation with Linda Farthing and ending on Friday. So if you want to hear these conversations early, if you want to hear these full conversations this week, then sign up and become a patron. Patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. Now, of course, we never want money to be an object when it comes to one's ability to hear our content. We're doing this show to educate people, not to make a buck. So, of course, each conversation will be made available on our YouTube page for everyone to see. It'll just be 2 to 3 weeks later after it's released for patrons. You know, we want to reward patrons for their support. It means a lot, and they really do help keep the show on the air. But, you know, it's unfortunate that here in the United States, we really honestly have just no idea about what is going on in the rest of the world very often. Even when there are extremely important events happening, and even when our own government has a hand in it. You know, if we had more time, I would personally like to do more education on foreign affairs for y'all, for the audience, but also for myself. I'm very uneducated on these issues, and it's very important to be educated on these issues. But unfortunately, we only have an hour and a half every Saturday. So this is going to be our first foray into this kind of thing. We may not get to do it often, but I hope you will enjoy and learn something from it. I know that I did. Our first conversation was with Linda Farthing. She is a writer, an author, and a reporter who has been doing work in Bolivia for years. She even has 3 books on the country. We wanted to talk to her for a broader historical context for what's happened last year in Bolivia. You know, a lot of us couldn't even place this country on a map, so I felt like it was important to get a better understanding of the country before diving right in. We talked about everything from geography to the Spanish conquistadors, to the Democratic Revolution, to the movement towards socialism, and more with Linda Farthing. We really appreciated her taking the time to talk with us. Here is that conversation.
So my name is Linda Farthing. I'm a writer and a journalist, although I have done many other things in my life. I have been involved in working in Bolivia for about 35 years. I've written 3 books. I'm now in the process of finishing a book about what happened in the last year, about the coup. And I've lived there off and on over those 35 years, but for a total of about 15 years.
Evo Morales was elected in 2005. Can you tell us a little bit about the pre-Morales Bolivia? What was Bolivia like?
The country was the second after Mexico in having a revolution. You had this indigenous majority, most of whom were living in serf-like conditions. I mean, not slavery, but serf-like conditions on large estates controlled by that elite population, for the most part, light-skinned European heritage population. The revolutionary period went on for about 12 years under a great deal of pressure from the United States that initially was most interested in Bolivia's tin reserves. They rearmed the military, who subsequently had managed to pull off a coup in 1964, and that coup lasted until 1982. And the organized workers, the miners, led by the miners, and at various points, indigenous peoples, organized indigenous peoples, managed to force out the military, and there was a return to democracy in 1982. And the country has been, I would say, except for the last year, it's had some very wobbly transitions from one government to another, but it has been largely democratic. Historically, government belonged only to elites, and working class people, the only ways in which they could really influence the outcome of what government would do was to march in the streets. And but then with this process of them becoming mayors and being in charge of municipalities and actually having budgets, they started to gain experience in administration, and they started to see government, I think, increasingly as a way, as a mechanism that they could actually make change, that they had the numbers, that if they could make democracy be treated as democracy and avoid having votes bought by whatever political party it was, that they could actually take over political power. So they formed a party in the mid-1990s, which is the MAS party, which is Evo Morales's party, and they managed to get a couple of senators, or several natural senators elected by the late 1990s.
The MAS is not like political parties here in the U.S., but it's a coalition of different social movement organizations like the labor unions and the indigenous movements and things like that. And this is the movement that Evo Morales came out of.
Right. I mean, I think that people certainly saw initially. I think things have changed considerably now, but at the beginning, they really saw the MAS as a coalition of social organizations, and that the social organizations, the unions, whether they were labor unions or peasant unions, really controlled the MAS, and that it was theirs. I mean, people would say to you in the early days, this is ours. I think that is one of the lessons, that the importance of organizing, the importance of political education, of helping people to understand, or working with people from their experience to help them understand why it is in their interest to support certain political movements, parties, whatever, initiatives. As opposed to not doing so. The MAS did, it was a surprise. I mean, they won the election in 2005, and it was a surprise.
What were some of the things that the MAS ran on in 2005? Like, why were they elected? And then, to what extent did they fulfill them?
So they were elected on a campaign or a platform of undoing neoliberalism, of making government work for people, particularly for low income people, and reducing poverty. And they did. They managed to do all those things effectively. I mean, they really were quite effective on all those fronts. They introduced a social welfare system that provided small stipends to like pregnant women, children who stayed in school, and the elderly, which were very small, but for very poor people made a huge amount of difference in terms of being able to feed themselves and take care of their families. So in that sense, they were very successful.
Right. And the, that I think is very important for the people, the people in those places. Could you kind of quantify the real material gains to the extent that you remember?
All right. So when Morales came into power, this I'm reading from the book I'm working on, he inherited a poverty rate of close to 60%. of the of the entire population. Rural poverty would have been much higher, somewhere around 80%. Right, there it is, which in rural and most indigenous areas rose as high at 80%, with an inequality index of the Gini index of 0.58. I think the United States is about 0.44 in terms of inequality, which is the highest of any of the industrialized countries. The minimum wage, I think, quadrupled in the 14 years that Morales was in power. So those kinds of measures meant that of course, the economy was growing. So in fact, the people at the top actually did very well. They did not, it wasn't like their taxes increased. It wasn't like it was a pie and the pie was redistributed. What happened was the pie got bigger. But a lot of the benefits of the pie getting bigger were directed to the lowest part of the society, the poorest people in the society. So extreme poverty, I've got those figures, in Bolivia dropped from approximately 36% to 17%. And overall poverty, and when we say extreme poverty, we're talking about people who are living, I think it's $1 a day is extreme poverty in that context. And overall poverty dropped from 48% to 23%. So you can see that poverty dropped by half. I mean, that's not to say there's still some poverty and there still is an extreme poverty in Bolivia, but it really dropped substantially. And a large number of people actually started to move economically into the middle class and have more middle class aspirations. It was substantial, and it was something that happened throughout Latin America, throughout all of those countries.
Linda, thanks so much for talking to us. I really appreciate your time. I know we went a little bit over, but I really enjoyed the conversation. I think it'll be really informative.
Thanks a lot. Good to talk to you, Jake. Ciao. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Tutor. Randy couldn't pass, you sent him to work. Bradford couldn't pass, you sent him to a tutor. Randy couldn't pass, you just sent his ass up.
Good morning, folks, and welcome back to today's special edition of the Valley Labor Report, the Bolivia episode. My name is Jacob Morrison, here with my co-host, David Story. This whole show, you'll be listening to pre-recorded interviews that David and I did with subject matter experts on different aspects of Bolivia. You just finished listening to parts of our interview with Linda Farthing, which gave a broader historical context for the Bolivian situation today. If you found it interesting and you want to listen to the rest of the hour-long conversation, then become a patron. Her interview will be published exclusively for patrons on patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. It'll also be released in full for everyone else in approximately 2 to 3 weeks. Next up, you'll hear our conversation with Angus McNelly about the relationship that labor and social movements had with the MAS government from 2005 to 2019. As was mentioned previously, MAS, M-A-S, stands for Movimiento al Socialismo, or the Movement Towards Socialism. It was a party that was created through a coalition of unions, indigenous groups, and social movements. And so, the relationship that these movements as independent entities had to the MAS as it held power in Bolivia with Evo Morales as president is something that is important to understand.
We are talking to Angus McNelly. He is an honorary research fellow, editor at Alternatus, and a professor at the School of Politics and International Relations at Queen Mary University of London. Angus, thanks for talking to us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for having me on. So I think the first thing to say about Bolivia is it's a really heterogeneous, diverse country, and it historically has a really weak state. So civil society has been a really, really important part of the direction historically that the country's taken, particularly after the 1952 revolution, where you saw a coalition of working class groups, indigenous groups, and the middle classes overthrow the government and set up what was called a national revolutionary government. And there were two poles to that government. The first was made up of middle-class intellectuals, but importantly, the labor movement made up the second pole of this. They call it the National Revolutionary State, which went from 1952 until the implementation of neoliberalism in 1985. So Bolivia is a country where tin mining was an important part of their history, and they used to read Marx down the lines. And they were super radical, were able, even during the military dictatorships of the 60s and 70s, to kind of play an important part politically, and were kind of played a salient role in the struggles against the implementation of neoliberalism. So the Labour was widely defeated across Latin America in the 1980s, but in Bolivia this was particularly the case, and the Central Obrera Boliviana, which is the Labour Central, suffered huge defeats in the 1980s, particularly in Calamarca, where that was that kind of last hurrah, which was around the same time that the British miners were defeated. However, they were displaced by an important rising indigenous movement. And this originally wasn't an identity politics driven movement. It was a class-based, came out of a kind of radicalization of the peasant movement, and was based in kind of syndicalist traditions. So the CESUTSB, which is the Peasants' Union, was joined to the Central Obrera Boliviana, the COB. And the most radical part of this peasant movement from the 1980s onwards was the coca growers, the cocaleros, because when people left the mines, as they were privatized and closed down after 1985, people had nowhere to go, there was no way to make money, and so people left the mines and went to the Chapare, which is where they grow coca. So they brought this radical kind of like Trotskyist tradition and then used it to organize these peasant movements. So the cocaleros became the kind of radical heart of the peasant movement. And in the 1990s, there was this debate that was like, should we try and build a state within a state? So like the Zapatistas in Mexico, or should we build a political instrument and try and take state power? And they opted for the latter, and the movement towards socialism on the mass is the party that they formed. And so Morales kind of rode to power off the back of this social movement radicalism, and found himself once in power at the head of a country which was already mobilized. And so in that sense, like, yes, he came to power in a strong position, but the period before him, this 5-year period of social movement activism, really shaped kind of politically where he could go in the first couple of years of his tenure. So they spent the first term taking the radical demands of social movements and trying to implement them, but implementing them through a liberal state and in a way that would keep their radical appearance without actually shaking anything up. So you had the nationalization of gas that did renegotiate contracts, which meant that the government was able to gain a larger slice of hydrocarbons rents. But in terms of ownership, Petrobras and Repsol kept most of their gas fields. They actually increased their share of hydrocarbons production in Bolivia. This is not a nationalization on anyone's book, but it looks like one. Similarly with the Constituent Assembly, the way that the Constituent Assembly was organized as firstly with a liberal elections for all of the representatives who had to participate as a member of a political party, 2/3 voting needed for all of the proposals. All of this was set up in order to take kind of different forms of political organization and more radical ideas and put them through this liberal machine that meant it came out the other end with a kind of a compromised outcome, shall we say. I think it's important to stress that, like, I don't think Morales implemented those games half-heartedly. I think more it was kind of a technocratic implementation of demands. That, as you said, did have real material gains. I mean, renegotiating the hydrocarbons contract did mean that the state all of a sudden had more money than it's ever had in its history in order to spend on infrastructure projects There are now highways between all the major cities. Electrification improved. Water and gas provision in the cities improved. You saw rising kind of minimum wage, which is really important for particularly formalized working classes, which increased kind of, from about 500 Bolivianos a month, which is about just $150 a month to over 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah, so a fourfold increase over 10 years. And what that had, it had a knock-on effect on wages in the informal sector, because aggregate demand went up, and so the amount of money flowing through the economy. So what hydrocarbons rent did was basically kind of heat up the effective demand and mean that people working in informal services and commerce all of a sudden had more customers, and so made more money, better access to credit. So if we're talking about kind of like along capitalist lines, things did really improve. The problem is that it wasn't the radical project that people hoped it would be. And it wasn't the radical project that movements asked for. So thank you both for having me, and best of luck with your organising.
Yeah, thank you.
Becker couldn't pass, you sent him to a tutor. Randy couldn't pass, you sent him to work. Bradford couldn't pass, you sent him to a tutor. Randy couldn't pass, you just sent him to... We are the masters! We are the masters! We are the masters of the universe!
All right, welcome back, folks. You are listening to a special episode of the Valley Labor Report on Bolivia. My name is Jacob Morrison, and my co-host is David Story. You just finished listening to portions of an interview with Angus McNelly on the relationship of labor and social movements to the mass government of President Evo Morales. Next, we talked to Ollie Vargas about the coup that took place in Bolivia against the democratically elected President Evo Morales in 2019.
So we have with us right now Ollie Vargas. He is a reporter in Bolivia with Calciton News. Ollie, can you, how long have you been reporting in Bolivia?
Well, I came just after the coup took place in November last year. I arrived, I think, early December, when Evo Morales' party, the movement towards socialism, was beginning to regroup, sort of reorientate itself after the quite traumatic events that took place in November last year. And I've been following that process since then, really, and it's a process that's still ongoing now.
We were interested in talking to you specifically about the events leading up to last year's election, the fraud allegations, and the removal of Morales from power. Can you talk to us about that?
Well, Evo Morales has won every presidential election that he stood in since 2005. So he'd won already 3 presidential elections. His last victory was in 2014, where he won with over 60% of the vote. And he was standing for the 4th re-election in October of last year. Now, the minority of the country that always opposed the mass had grown increasingly desperate, and they saw no sort of exit from what was very clearly going to be a victory for the mass. So before the elections, we begin to see a number of mobilizations, number of allegations that his candidacy is illegitimate and that there will be fraud in the elections. This is before any vote had been cast. The elections come and Morales wins with just over 10%. And in Bolivia's electoral law, you can win in the first round, if you have more than 10% than the second place. So Evo didn't manage to reach 50%. He got 47%, but it was 10 points above second place than sort of neoliberal centrist candidate Carlos Mesa. So what we see then is Carlos Mesa calls his supporters out. He makes sort of these allegations of electoral fraud, very similar to what Donald Trump has been talking about in the past week or so. So allegations without much basis, but calling his supporters out to the streets while vote counting was still going on. And what did his supporters do the night after the election? They went out and they burnt down vote counting centers, held violent protests in the cities of Potosí, Sucre, and also Tarija, I believe. So in 3 main cities, these protests turned violent. They burned down vote counting centers. That's something that presents a problem for doing a proper audit of the elections, because even during this sort of melee, ballot papers end up getting burned, end up getting destroyed by these sort of violent right-wing groups. And then we just see the situation get worse and worse. The violence escalates dramatically from the right-wing opposition. Figures from the US, such as Marco Rubio, sort of start tweeting that electoral fraud is taking place. Again, this is while vote counting is still ongoing, and they don't provide any evidence for these allegations. They make these sort of communications that further inflame the situation in Bolivia. And then what we see is these right-wing protests, these anti-Evo Morales protests, turn increasingly violent. So I think all of that came to a head in October last year.
And I wanted to underscore a couple other important points, like it wasn't just U.S. politicians that were making these unfounded allegations of voter fraud. It was the Organization of American States sent out letters. The New York Times, echoed these allegations. And since then, the Organization for American States, the OAS, the New York Times, they have all admitted that the allegations of voter fraud were unfounded, that these were not, that there was no documented evidence of any fraud by the MAS. And what ultimately ended up happening is that the military sent a letter to President Morales recommending that he leave office, right? And so pick us up there.
The country falls apart in a number of ways. I think in the United States and Europe, there's a certain discourse that socialism in Latin America has caused like total breakdown of society, and we mustn't follow that path. In fact, what happened in Bolivia was the reverse, is that 14 years of Evo Morales' government had provided Bolivia with the longest period of economic growth and of social stability. The moment Evo Morales left office, all of that broke down once the sort of pro-United States candidates came into power. So what we first saw was huge political repression. There was 2 massacres of pro-Evo Morales protesters in the first 10 days after the coup. But following that, there was also an incredibly serious economic crisis, an economic recession before the coronavirus hit. We're already seeing rising unemployment and economic slowdown before that hit. And then the pandemic hits. And what the government's response is to declare an immediate sort of lockdown, total lockdown, but without any kind of plan for how to help the majority of the population who works in the informal economy and who suddenly lost their income when the lockdown was declared. So people were locked away, and they, there was no such thing as furlough pay or subsidy checks. People were left to starve in huge numbers. And during that period, we saw unemployment triple, because what happens when people suddenly lose their incomes and have nothing to replace it? Consumer demand collapses. What happens after that? All small businesses across the board collapse. They no longer have customers. And since then, unemployment has more than tripled, and there's now a total economic crisis. the economy contracted 11% in that time. So that whole neoliberal approach, free market approach that was immediately implemented after Evo Morales was forced out of power, that triggered a very serious economic crisis. And that's part of the reason that the MAS was able to win later on. Because for 14 years under Evo Morales' government, the argument from the left was always that if the right take over, if the neoliberals take over, then you're going to be hungry, there's going to be total disarray. And I think that argument worked for a long time. But after 14 years, it's a long time, it's more than a decade, people began to think, well, maybe they're just trying to scare us, maybe this is just fear mongering. But now what people realize is that after just a few short months of having these right-wing politicians in power, society collapsed in an incredible way, and I think that's something that fed the victory of the left just a few weeks ago.
One of the things that you mentioned kind of in passing, but I didn't want to let go unemphasized, is that these right-wing economic policies, that was destroying the economy before the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And Luis Arce, who's now the president, he's an economist, and he was warning about this, what was going on months before the pandemic. I had the opportunity to interview him, and he talked about the fact that in Bolivia, what has been the most successful model has been state-led development. Because for big projects, big development projects that are required in countries like Bolivia, projects like sort of developing industrial capacity, manufacturing, these are things that are very, very long term. So the free market doesn't see a great deal of importance in them because they don't bring short-term profits, but they do have very large short-term costs. So the state is the only sort of motor that can sort of look long-term and then put the money down. And the decimation of the state industries was incredibly damaging for Bolivia to be able to be going into the pandemic with that going on. Of course, everywhere in the world had an economic crisis, is experiencing still an economic crisis because of the pandemic. But I think there's ways to approach it. The way that the Áñez regime approached the pandemic was just to lock people away without any plan for how to support anyone. And small businesses have completely collapsed across the board. People have lost their incomes, and that caused an even deeper economic crisis than there could have been. And the reason they posed a total lockdown so quickly was not because of the pandemic. Well, they did it for political reasons. Bolivia was about to go into an election. There were a huge amount of protests at the time, and they saw it. They took a political advantage of coronavirus to, end any kind of dissent, to sort of lock people at home, stop people protesting. So they're very, very eager. They were too eager to put a total lockdown when there should have been really a partial lockdown in which some sectors of the economy could have continued working to stop a total crisis.
So the election of President Luis Arce happened a few weeks ago now, and he's been sworn in.
And it comes with a basic problem that the right in Bolivia doesn't understand the character of the country because they don't want to. They're sort of repulsed by this culture, so they refuse to learn about it, and therefore they shoot themselves in the foot by the fact that the end result is that they don't understand the country, and then therefore they can't win elections if you don't understand the country. So the Bolivian right is incredibly short-sighted. Despite the fact that they'll show off about having studied at university, they have an incredibly narrow sort of worldview that stops them from understanding the realities of the majority of people in the country. I think that was very important for the MAS to be able to win with such a margin.
Ollie, thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, guys.
You are listening to the Valley Labor Report. My name is Jacob Morrison, and my co-host is David Story. Folks, we are trucking right along with our special episode on Bolivia. We just finished listening to portions of our conversation with Ali Vargas about the coup. Next up, we talked to an international human rights attorney about the human rights situation under the coup government. I'll take the opportunity here again to mention that these are only about 10-minute portions of hour-long conversations. So unfortunately, a lot of very interesting stuff does get left out. So if you want to be able to listen to the rest of these conversations this week, then support our work on patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. Otherwise, subscribe to our YouTube channel and you'll be able to hear the full conversations about 2 to 3 weeks from now. Without further ado, Thomas Becker, International Human Rights Attorney.
My name is Thomas Becker. I'm an international human rights lawyer with University Network for Human Rights. I've spent most of the last 15 years living here in Bolivia, working on human rights issues. Most of those years working at Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic. And I've worked on a range of issues, worked directly with social movements. I guess the main work I've done has been, I've worked on a case against Bolivia's ex-president, Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, for his role in massacring protesters and social movement leaders. He's known as kind of El Gringo, the gringo, spent most of his life living in the United States, part of the oligarchy here in Bolivia. So we brought a lawsuit against him, the victims, and we won the lawsuit a few years ago and been back and forth in an appeal and just won our appeal a couple months ago. It's the first lawsuit against a living ex-president ever in the United States for human rights violations. And I should just kind of plug, really it was a movement-driven lawsuit from folks on the ground, from the Bolivians. But I've also worked on several other, human rights issues here, including documenting abuses under Evo Morales, definitely under the most recent interim government of Áñez, as well as even before. So I've worked on human rights here for quite a long time, perhaps too long. But I also work on human rights in other countries. I've worked for years with the Zapatistas, worked in India with social movements there. So yeah, that's a little bit about me.
Everybody at this point knows that Morales was kicked out of office. There was a coup in Bolivia. And then after that, Janine Áñez took over. She held the office of the presidency for about a year. And there was a lot happened in that year. So, just kind of, what happened?
So I'll just start with week one. Her third day in power, and I was actually here, not just here in Bolivia. I was at the site of the massacre. Her government carried out a massacre in the town of Sacaba. A bunch of cocaleros and other campesino farmers were marching into the city, into Cochabamba, and then on to La Paz, which is kind of the administrative capital here, to protest this new government, unelected government. And it wasn't actually necessarily a protest for Evo Morales. It was a protest against the hyper-radical violence against indigenous women were getting beat in the streets. Motoqueros, motorcycle gangs were grabbing them and just kind of dragging them along by their hair. And they were burning the indigenous flag, both kind of these right-wing fascist groups, but also members of the government. And so they set out on this multi-day protest. And outside of Cochabamba, one of the big cities where there are a lot of kind of lighter skinned folks that didn't want the Indians coming in, the police and military had basically a blockade, and they massacred the people. They told the women to come to the front, told them to lay down their flags and gas masks, and they were going to let them pass. And when they did that, then they opened fire on them. And it was, as I mentioned earlier, like we have to talk about race in this, because as they're shooting, they chased down people, they beat them, people ran into homes to hide, and they beat them and yelled anti-indigenous statements at them. They shot people, they targeted people who were trying to help others. And there was a military flying overhead with the soldier allegedly shooting at people from above. At the end of the day, there was about 120 plus injured and 11 killed officially. But there were certainly more. Like I said, I was in the town right after the massacres. I was there. There was blood everywhere. I saw the bullet holes. I saw the crying mothers. I went straight to the hospitals and was with the victims. And I spoke with people that were in hiding who had injuries, who were like, I'm not going to go to the hospital. They're going to come find us and they're going to disappear me. They're going to disappear that dead person's body. They're going to register me and come after my family. So the numbers are we don't have accurate numbers, but they were certainly higher than the official numbers. This is day 3. That same day, or perhaps it was the day before, sorry, Áñez passed a decree giving immunity to soldiers that killed others. This is a completely illegal decree, but this is, her third day in power. 4 days later, same thing in Sencata, which actually, as we speak, that's tomorrow. The year anniversary is tomorrow on the 19th. Another massacre, 11 killed, dozens injured, and we're just in the first week, and she's carried out 2 massacres, passed an illegal decree. I couldn't count the number of people that were illegally arrested in that week, people that were tortured when they were arrested. I spoke to people who were sexually assaulted when they were arrested, week 1. And to give context, because again, Bolivia, these numbers may not sound, hundreds of injured and a couple dozen killed may not sound like a lot when we have like sensationalized, you read about Syria and boy, that happens in like a neighborhood in a day a lot of times. But in Bolivia, November was the 2nd deadliest month in the history of democratic Bolivia in terms of state forces killing civilians. The first deadliest was the Black October, the one I was talking about with Goni. The second deadliest was this November. This is an interim government whose mandate is to call elections. But what they're doing is gunning down protesters who express, their right to protest and who express dissatisfaction with a government that came in illegally and perpetuated hyper-racist policies. So I conducted it through Harvard's clinic and University Network for Human Rights. We conducted a study or an investigation for a good 7-8 months. And really I've kind of continued it since, but we published this a few months ago. Talked to hundreds of people, hundreds of witnesses there. And everybody was just blown away. I mean, like I said, they had them lay down their sticks with their flags and their gas masks, and when they were kind of at their most vulnerable is when they attacked. And the really upsetting part, and I still remember this, frankly, I'll remember it forever. I mean, it was some of the most gruesome, and I've worked in war zones, but it was really gruesome, the stuff I saw. And I remember being in the hospital and people telling me, and some of them just waking up out of coma or whatever, they just woken up for the first time since they were shot, and saying, you'll see, tomorrow they're going to call us Indians, they're going to call us terrorists, they're going to call us drug traffickers, and no one's going to believe us because I'm brown. And even with all my context and understanding the racism here, I thought there's no way. But what happened the next day is all the press repeated what the government said. Oh, no, they were the protesters were the violent ones. They shot themselves to make us look bad. That was the government's line. That brothers and sisters turned to each other and killed their sisters and brothers to make the government look bad. And the Mas Party was behind it. And these are narco thugs. And what they did, and we spoke to, and actually I've seen footage of it, and I spoke to a couple witnesses who said they paraded people they arrested. They put weapons into their hand and filmed them just to make them look bad. I spoke to the spokesperson of the police there that was in charge of the operations there. They said they found 0 guns on the protesters, but it didn't matter. You know what I mean? The narrative here was, no, they shot themselves. In Sencata, they were there to blow up the gas plant to kill all of El Alto, which is even more wild. Most of the protesters in this area, Sencata, are from the zone. There is a gas plant. If they blew it up, they would have killed their entire family and all their neighbors. But that was the dominant narrative. And it really has been the narrative for most of the last year, because those who've tried to say, no, something different happened, were arrested for sedition, were arrested for terrorism. The TV channels that would talk about this, or the different forms of the press, mostly independent press, because the commercial press really got scared into changing their tone. The journalists that spoke out against the government were fired. So most of the mainstream outlets became very pro-government. But independent stations, particularly indigenous stations, were shut down. The government shut down something like 53 in the first month, because they were saying, hey, what happened here was a massacre. or this government is behaving like an authoritarian government. And if you use that sort of language against this government, you were put on a list of seditious people. I allegedly was on a list of seditious people. I mean, I got harassed by the government. I certainly got harassed by parastate groups. I got attacked by parastate groups. You know, just to give a little context, again, I'm suing an ex-president. I have enemies here. I've never experienced the kind of violence that I've seen over the last year. I was attacked just in, you know, a year ago. In about a month, I was attacked, I think, 7 times by these kind of groups that allegedly were protesting for democracy against Evo Morales. But obviously, you know, there's nothing democratic about beating someone for doing human rights work. And I only say this because, look, all the privilege I have as a white American who teaches at an overrated place like Harvard Law School, you know, I have all the privilege in the world. If they're going to attack someone like me, you can only imagine how they're going to treat an indigenous woman or a campesino farmer without the privilege I have. And it's just been a hyper violent year. Like I said, unprecedented since Bolivia became a democracy. This is something I have a friend who is ahead of her husband was disappeared during the dictatorships. She said, I'm more scared under the interim government Áñez than I was during the dictatorships. And that's what it's been like for indigenous people, what it's been like for leftists, what it's been like for a lot of journalists, and what it's like for Moss Party members. I mean, we're only now starting to kind of grasp how many fled actually, we still don't know. But what I can say is over the last few weeks, I mean, in the streets, I've met people who've come up and been like, thank you. I just came back to the country finally because I've been in hiding. I was in political exile. Thank you for producing this report because nobody was talking about it. And I was able to do it because I was in the United States at the time. Nobody could kill me. You know, no one could come after me. But the number of people that had to go in hiding, particularly those that were associated with Evo Morales' party, was off the charts. I mean, I've never seen this in my 15 years here. And I've talked to so many people who said, I've never seen this. I hadn't seen this kind of behavior since the dictatorships. And many said, boy, it's even worse. And this has been Bolivia for the last year.
Thomas, thanks for talking to us. Yeah. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks for having an awesome program.
I appreciate it. I appreciate it.
Lonely dead, stuck, bleeding pig. Lonely ditch, I choose to dead. Inside.
All right, welcome back, folks. You are listening to the Valley Labor Report with your hosts, Jacob Morrison and David Story. This is a special episode on Bolivia. All morning, we've been bringing you different interviews with different subject matter experts on different aspects of Bolivia. In the following segment, we talked to 2 Bolivian unionists about life in the labor movement in Bolivia. First, we speak to Sister Roxana. She is a member of the Coca Growers Union. And then we speak to Brother Rolando. He is the leader of the Central Obrera Boliviana, or the Bolivian Workers' Center in Santa Cruz, which we can think of as analogous to a local labor council.
Sister Roxana, sorry for the technical
Brother
difficulties,
Jacob.
But I was, I'm interested, it was Kathy that I was talking to, and she said that you've been a member of the Coca Growers Union for about 30 years. Can you tell us what it was like when you first joined and kind of what was happening during that time?
I've been the director of this union since I was very young. I'm 53 years old, and this has been an organization of only women, and they've been doing it for almost 20 years. During this time, there was a lot of machismo. We couldn't organize very well as women because the men took all the power and the women had less power. Afterwards, we as women organized and we took the power. Now we're cultivators of coca. Now we're directed by women. We're on an equal level with men. Before, they thought we should be cooking in the house or doing the chores or taking care of the children. But we as women work together with the men growing the coca leaves. We also work in the organization. They take us into account half and half. Before it was different. They didn't take us into account. Now we as women were really organized. Before we as women weren't organized. We were suffering, but we have been able to organize ourselves as women.
That's really amazing. What was it like to kind of fight against some of that machismo as women in the Coca Growers Union, and around what time period are you talking about that this transition happened from kind of a male-dominated organization to an organization that represents women and takes women into account as well?
It was 1989 or 1988. At that time, it was only the men participating in the organization. The women were at home, but we had rights and we had a voice, and sometimes the women say our opinions more than the men. We make better decisions than the men. We also give suggestions. And that's why we fought as women to organize and to keep organizing. Now, equally, we get positions of power. They said the women should be at home and they should take care of home. And then in the union, they said, when you come, you should be cooking for us. There's a house for the union, and they said the women should be cleaning it. They said only the men should be able to participate. There was a lot of machismo. The women also wanted to express our opinions. They said, what do the women know? But sometimes the women do better than men. It's not to humiliate the men or discriminate.
Are the women making the same per? I assume they are paid per kilo or something like that. Are they equal to the men on the pay as well?
Sí, sí. Es lo mismo. Las mujeres el 50%, los hombres el 50%.
Yes, we get paid the same. 50% for the women and 50% for the men.
Speaking of the marches and the demonstrations, there's been a lot of
Hola.
there's been a lot of political upheaval in Bolivia recently around the around the coup last year. How has
No recientemente, desde años pasados, desde hace más de.
Not only recently, since years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there were always confrontations. They told us to remove the coca leaves and then they would give us things in return, small things. It was not enough to cover our economic needs at home. If we can't make ends meet, we suffer more because we have to feed our families. We have to send our children to study. We didn't get enough compensation. They were trying to compensate us only halfway.
So what was it like being a coca grower under the Morales government from 2005 to 2019? You mentioned that I said something about recently demonstrations and marches, and you said not only recently. So was there a lot of conflict even under the Morales government?
Más antes que cuando.
It was prior to Morales being president. During the 14 years he was president, we didn't have any conflict. We as women grew more powerful. They showed us we are valued, that we are respected. That was during 10 years of his government. There was no machismo. It was getting easier. But this last year, under the new government, it was more difficult. But thank God, and thanks to the fight we fought, we came back to socialism, and I think we're going to be fine again. Last year, when we had the coup, we were very afraid and we didn't know what to do because they surprised us. We've had many coups d'etats in the past. We have to mobilize. We have to block the roads, but then they kill us and they militarize and we keep fighting. We ask for elections now so we can have a government that has legal elections. That government supposedly was temporary. It was only supposed to stay for 3 months, but then they stayed for a year.
Right. So how do you feel about the new government of President Luis Arce?
Ahora me siento feliz.
Now I feel happy. I hope we have a lot of tranquility. Because that government comes from the humble class, the middle class. And it's a socialist government because we as poor people deserve to be well treated. We have no money. We eat what we produce.
Aquí más que todo para la gente de
Here, for the poor people, for humble people, for the people who live only off of their jobs. We don't have much money, and a socialist president helps the people like us. It helps us here in Cochabamba to work. We all have to work to eat. We all have to work because here we have responsibilities. We cannot live off the work of others, and I like that because if not, we would have people taking advantage of the situation or taking advantage of other people's jobs. Everybody has to work because if not, what can I do? What do I have to live on? I need my seeds. I need my elements for the fisheries. We are not afraid of socialism. We do not have guns. It's only the organization. To be together as an organization and work together. That's what I would say in big strokes is what socialism is. To live a good life all together.
Good evening, Brother Rolando. I really appreciate you taking your time to talk to us. I know that it's pretty late there in Bolivia. We're talking as it's 9 p.m. on Thursday, November the 19th. So I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It really means a lot.
Sí, acá es buenas noches. Tenemos las...
Yes, of course. Good evening from Bolivia, specifically from Santa Cruz. I'd like to say hello to all of your listeners, viewers, brothers and sisters from everywhere in the world.
So, Brother Rolando, could you introduce yourself to the people that are going to be listening to this interview later? Who are you, and what do you do there in Bolivia for the labor movement?
Sí, soy el compañero Rolando Gorda, me dicen el compañero Flaco Gorda.
Of course, my name is Rolando Gorda. They call me Brother Flaco Gorda here in Santa Cruz. We are the basic soldiers. Tomorrow, we're going to elect a new executive committee. We have about 56 sectors, many of those from the proletariat class, from the labor class. Those of us who want to direct the departmental politics of the region. I am work in the petroleum industry. I'm in the proletariat, and I work in the operations sector. And I've just finished my third round, and we're starting our next round to go to elections for new elected members.
And the position that you hold, what is the position that you hold in the organization there?
La posición es que acaba mi gestión de ser ejecutivo.
My position is I am an executive manager, and we're going to go into re-elections called upon by the petroleum sector to dispute the executive committee of Santa Cruz. I anticipate with complete humility that the Congress that we're at right now is trending about 95% that they will give us the trust again to continue this labor movement through the Secretariat right now.
That's great. That's great. So how did you get involved in the labor movement? How long have you been involved in the labor movement there in Bolivia, and what made you want to work so heavily in the labor movement?
Bueno, yo vengo de Camiri. Fíjense que allá por los años de mi niñez.
Well, I'm from Camiri, around that area, around my childhood. It was a small town, mainly a petroleum-based economy, the petroleum capital of the country. There were, two choices in my youth. When I was very young, very young, I lost my mother in a car accident. She was very young, and I had the responsibility of taking care of, 5 of my younger children. So I was forced to find a job. And obviously, you see lots of injustices through your childhood, and it starts to make you into a dreamer. And it was possible to fight these injustices through a union. And in Camiri, the strongest union was the petroleum union, and more or less that was our school. After high school, we came to Santa Cruz, and well, we've been working in this movement for 30 years, working in this sector. But also I've been working for about 15 years as an organizer, as a leader, as a delegate, from intermediary leader. I've been a subsecretary of my union, the largest union in the country, and I've had the opportunity to be the first petroleum worker in the labor movement in Santa Cruz that occupies the executive position of the workers' movement. This had also allowed me to be a candidate for the governorship of Santa Cruz, using socialism as my instrument. But obviously, first and foremost, it's my union militancy is primary in my function.
How are the workers feeling now with the new government coming into place? And it sounds like your elections for the executive committee or the executive council is coming up. Are the workers, the proletariat on the ground, feeling excited about this new era?
Liliana, entiendo. A ver, antes de entrar a responderte,
well, let me see. Before I can respond the question, I also can say that last year, during the October elections, before the coup, I was also candidate to second senator for the Department of Santa Cruz. We were elected as second senator with the help of my worker brothers and sisters. And obviously the president at that moment said that I wasn't just a candidate of Santa Cruz. He said I was a candidate for the whole country that was represented, the workers. Because of the coup, we could not assume the Senate position. We were very persecuted. I think I was the most persecuted head throughout Santa Cruz. We had to hide in the woods for about 27 days until this climate and this pressure could pass, and threats to my life, to protect my life. So it's been a difficult time. Last year, we have to remember as well, there was no fraud. It was a coup. It was sponsored by the OEA and by Mr. Amado, and fascism, because in Santa Cruz you have to know that the powerful people always want to impose their will, and obviously the workers, the proletariat class, to social organizations, they always look down upon us. So it's a pretty complicated department. The transnationals, they had a same kind of coup of last year to steal our natural resources, specifically our lithium. I think that's what's provoked the coup, but thankfully the consciousness of the people have imposed themselves through the vote. We're not the culture of fighting or whatnot, we're the culture of the vote. We are brothers and sisters that historically, workers, proletariats, our brothers and sisters, our indigenous brothers and sisters have given their lives, have given their blood, and with their support we've recovered democracy. So also with the, today the opportunity, because of the 18th of October, the consciousness of the people through a general indefinite strike decreed by the Central Labor Force, our young people, our indigenous people, our workers, we were able to recover our democracy with more than 55% in favor. So the workers and the Bolivian people in particular, the proletariat class, we are sure that with President Lucho Arce and David Chacoanca, we are going to recover the economy. The workers, we know that we have to work our base so that the economy will recover with the leadership of Brother Lucho Arce, without forgetting our legitimate demands are to reivindicate our workers that have been very vulnerable, and with the the memory that every 15 minutes there was a worker on the streets, or people were thrown out into the streets. And that's what happened during the transitional coup government happened. And now the government that emerges from the people, from the working class, we have the commitment to recover the economy, to consolidate the future of our children and our new generations.
That's powerful.
Welcome back, folks. This is the Valley Labor Report. Your co-hosts today and every Saturday morning are myself, Jacob Morrison, and David Story. This is the final segment of our special episode on Bolivia. I hope you've enjoyed it. I know that I have. I believe that David has. And if you like this kind of thing, let us know. You can tweet us at Labor Reporters or Facebook us at the Valley Labor Report. If it gets a really good reception, then maybe we do it more often. And I'll take this opportunity to give one final reminder that all of these interviews are only snippets, and there's a lot of good stuff that just simply couldn't make it into the radio cut. If you want to hear all of the full interviews this week, then support us on patreon.com/The Valley Labor Report. And no worries, if you can't support us financially, totally understand, not a big deal. Just make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel so that you can see when all of the interviews are made public for everybody. So we're going to end today's show with a message from Ollie's interview on lessons to learn from Bolivia's labor and social movements on enacting change that benefits ordinary working people.
There's so many lessons, I think, that Bolivia can take to the world, but I think the MAS as a political movement has always been built on the formula of combining social struggle, labor struggle, with the electoral struggle, with electoral participation. but one had to come before the other. You can't just say, oh, we'll marry both together if you don't have a labor movement, if you don't have social struggle. There was 30 years of social struggle without real political representation before that social struggle was strong enough to be able to articulate itself politically and build a political instrument. And I think when it's just, when the time comes when the social movement, social struggle is strong enough to be able to impose itself in politics, it shouldn't settle for, supporting a party that will speak on its behalf, that will promise to represent it in Congress or in power. It should be an instrument that is built out of the social movements itself as an instrument, as a way for labor struggle, social struggle to insert itself in politics on its own terms, to govern itself, rather than waiting for others to represent it. I think that's how the mass is governed. That's why it has the trust of people, because people don't see, mass officials coming down from on high asking, oh, if you vote for us, we'll represent you. No, people understand that it's my party, it's our party. Through my participation in my unions and things, I am the party. So I think that organic link with people is the only reason that the mass has been around for now nearly 2 decades. Every election they change parties, they change the name of their parties. They're always called something very generic, like Together, or the Civic Party, or We Believe, things like this, things that don't mean anything, because they're just like shell companies essentially for different interests and different opportunists. The mass is the only party that stood in every election for the past 20 years, because it has a root amongst all many people. I think that's the most important thing.
Let's go!